Okay, Michaela, you can start.
Okay, so you can hear me, that's great. Oh yeah, fine. You can also see me now. Thanks a lot for introducing me and my study. So I just get ready with my slides and start with my background. Um, I can look back at about 15 years experience in psychological assessment and psychometric evaluation of psychological assessments. And since 2009, I work for Medical University Vienna, and that's when I got into medical education, especially involved with educational assessment. My university is connected with a huge hospital. You can see it here, the two towers. We educate lots of students, so every year about 720 students starts. You see the big lecture hall here, and this cohort doesn't fit in one lecture theater, so we need 2 or 3 lecture theaters to educate them. Vienna is the capital of Austria, and you can see the air view of Vienna here. There's a lot of green around, and this nice garden here with the greenhouse. I hope you can see the mouse here is the place where I like to take a walk with my husband and my daughter. For this presentation, I Googled pictures Austria, and the picture here above is what I found first. It's a nice mountain village landscape. It's the village of Hallstatt. Obviously, that's the most Googled picture of Austria. So it's time to switch to my project. My project focuses on self-judging of history-taking skills. So you self-judge every time when you ask yourself, how am I doing? I'm working on this project together with Annick de Bruyn and Jan van Marienburg. Why is self-judging so important for us? So we say it's important because self-judging how one is doing influences one's learning. Just imagine a student practicing history-taking, a medical student practicing history-taking. When he self-judges inaccurately, e.g. he overestimates his performance, he is likely to stop learning too early. So his steering of learning is impaired. He will stop practicing, he will stop thinking about how can I improve, what do I need to improve. This will result in the student's weak performance. So when we assess the student later, he will get a bad mark because he stopped practicing too early. And we also assume that the student is also prone for weak transfer of skills to similar situations. So our conclusion is, for practicing complex skills without direct supervision, accurate self-judgments are really vital to be able to improve your performance. And what we experience is that our medical students, they start practicing without direct supervisions very early, especially in the history-taking domain. So as a medical educator, I think I should not only educate our medical students to become good history takers, but I also should help them to become good self-judges in their own history taking, so they can use the practice opportunities in the clinical placements better. The problem is, how can we educate learners to self-judge accurately? The problem here is we don't have a lot of information about how self-judgments work in the domain of history taking, and we nearly know nothing how we can influence students' self-judgments in this domain. However, we are kind of lucky because there are in other domains general models of self-judgments available. Their self-judgments are seen as a result of a metacognitive monitoring process. So this, how am I doing, is said to be a metacognitive monitoring process, and the result of this process is a self-judgment. And what's more important, this metacognitive monitoring process is informed by so-called perceivable cues. So we need to use cues to self-judge. And there are different types of cues. Something like objective observations, that's what you can see and hear. Subjective experiences, that's what you feel. You're feeling good or feeling bad. And, of course, everything you know about the domain, so what you have learned on the knowledge side. So a typical domain where this model is used is understanding of text comprehension. Just give you a short example to illustrate how this works. So when you read a text, the task you do very often as a student, and you are later tested on your understanding of the text, you are very prone to stick to cues like, oh, the text is 15 lines and I read it twice and yeah, that was a short text. Or you have a subjective experience like, oh, the text is great, it's boring, I finished it first, it's an interesting text or something else. And you have prior knowledge, something like, I'm always reading quick or slow when I'm reading in a group. So these cues, we know that students use them and typically overestimate their performance. They said, it's a short text, it's interesting, I read it quick or slow, whatever it is. So they feel good after reading the text. But the lucky thing is we can easily influence students to be better self-judges. We have to teach them to summarize the paragraph you just read and to write some keywords with the main ideas, because this will give them new objective observations, new subjective experience. Mostly this is something like, it was difficult to come up with a keyword, and I only wrote just one keyword. So obviously I don't really understand what's this text about, and usually that's much more realistic as compared to a later following test of text comprehension. So what would be really, really lovely is if we could find some type of prompting our medical students can use when they practice history taking with their patients to come up with accurate judgments. So it's time to zoom into the studies we did to move towards this very ambitious goal. We started with a very important detail. We set out to find out how do students self-judge their history-taking performance. So how do they proceed when they self-judge, and do they behave like we predicted by this general model of self-judgment? We had our students video record one of their encounters with a simulated patient in the skills lab. And we had them select scenes for self-judging. They judged whether they were satisfied or not with the scene, and we had them elaborate their judgment in writing. In the background photo, you can see an example how this looked like. So they wrote in a prepared sheet of paper, and they judged by making a cross whether they are satisfied or not satisfied. We analyzed the material of 20 students. We used content analysis, and we used the general model of self-judgment as a theoretic model for defining the categories for the analysis. Our sample was carefully picked to control for effects of group and patient case and actor. So we had a new actor for each of these 20 students, and each student was trained in a different small group by a different teacher. So we hope to have got rid of teacher and group effects. What was the main finding? Luckily, the main finding was that the students proceed in self-judging the history-taking skills as suggested by the general model of self-judgment, with one exception. So The exception is you have to be aware of the complexity of a history-taking situation. So please don't be shocked when you see the next slide. It's a little bit crowded. So what's the complexity in the situation? We found that the students do 3 different types of judgments. They judge their satisfaction with coverage of content. At this stage, they are doing structured history taking, so their judgments are like, oh, I covered everything I should, or oh, I forgot to ask this and that. Of course, they judge their satisfaction with performance of process skills. And, very important, our teachers were very satisfied. They also judged the interplay between process skills and the reaching of the communication goal. So our teachers were very satisfied because that's what they try to teach them. And of course, they also try to teach them to cover the content and to perform each single process skills. What cues do the students use? So what is so special in the history-taking situation? In the history-taking situation, special is that there are 2 persons emitting cues. There are student-emitted cues and patient-emitted cues. And also very important for our teachers is that there is something we call student and patient reciprocity. So the student sees how the patient responds and how the student himself responds to the patient. There is the subjective experience, like, oh, that's difficult, or that's easy, or oh, that's great. There are knowledge and beliefs, and there is something like situation-specific judgment, which I will not cover here because that's a lot of details. So, now we know that we can use the model in the domain of history taking, and this drives us towards our next question. So what was interesting for us after knowing that we can use the general model of self-judgment was how high and low performing students differ in their self-judging. Yeah? In the beginning, we said weak self-judgments will impair learning. So we now assume there are low-performing or weak-performing students that are those that have impaired learning, and then there are the high-performing students that are the students that have a very good way of learning. We used the same procedure as in the first study. We included 40 students, so 20 students performing high and 20 students performing low. We identified our high and low performing students by having a look at the overall skills lab exam that includes 2 history-taking stations, 2 basic clinical procedure stations, 2 stations of physical examinations, and 2 written stations. They all include in some way a kind of history, as a kind of communication towards patients, except for the written station. So students performing high in all those 6 practical stations, they all have to use kind of communication skills to get the highest marks. What did we find? We found differences between those groups, and the first differences we found was that high-performing students, they select more scenes for self-judging than the low-performing students. So when the low-performing students selected just 3 scenes as they had to for the exercise, the high-performing students at least found 1 scene more or 2 scenes more they found relevant for self-judging. Luckily, the high-performing students also used the cues differently. They used more often the objective observations that the student emitted, and especially the high-performing students, those were the ones focusing strongly on the student and patient reciprocity. Also, the high-performance students included the subjective experiences more often in their judgments and their knowledge and beliefs about history taking. And what you can't see on the slide, the high-performing students, they tend to combine different cues more often than the low-performing students. So the low-performing students would say, oh, I'm not satisfied with the content I covered because I see now that I missed something. So they only use their knowledge and beliefs, and they don't include the cues emitted by patients. What we also found was that the high-performing students more often focus on their performance of process skills and the interplay between process skills and communication goal. So actually all of the judgments judging the interplay between process skills and communication goal came from the high-performing students. We had, I think, only one judgment or two in the low-performing group. An interesting side result is about the satisfaction and dissatisfaction judgments. The high-performing students, when they judge the coverage of content, they usually ended up with being dissatisfied with the coverage of content. And when they judge the interplay of process skills and communication goal, they more often or most often ended up with being satisfied. So, those of you who are familiar with the problem of self-judging accurately may have realized now that our studies haven't tapped another very important question related to self-judging up to now, and that's the question: do students self-judge accurately as compared to teacher judgment? So, are our students able to judge accurately in this setting, or are they as prone to inaccurate self-judgment as we have found in other domains? So we did a third study, and we took the selected scenes. Yeah, we had the students select scenes as in the previous studies, and we had the students elaborate on the self-judgments as in study 1 and 2. And we took those student-selected scenes for the main study and handed it over to 3 teachers or 3 external judges, had them judge the scenes, whether they are satisfied or dissatisfied with students' performance in the scene, and had the teachers also elaborate their judgments. And we had a small side study embedded in this one to find out whether the students select relevant scenes or not, because that's also the question: are students able to find scenes in their videos that are really relevant for self-judgment? So, what did we find here? We used only 20 students for this study because it was kind of very time-consuming for our external judges. We had 3 external judges doing the judgments and doing the elaborations, and we aggregated them to have an aggregated satisfied judgment for a student-selected scene and an aggregated not satisfied judgment. And we have student self-judgment here on the other side, satisfied, not satisfied. And what we found was that there is kind of a lot of correspondence. We have here 74% of all the scenes, of all the self-judged scenes, they correspond with the aggregated external judgment. And what you can see here, the self-judgment not satisfied with the external judgment satisfied, there are more of them than the other way around. So students judge satisfied and the external judges judge not satisfied. So we have more underestimation than overestimation in case of the non-corresponding judgments. So that was kind of positive and kind of interesting finding. And so what about the side results? Do the students really select interesting scenes and scenes that are worth judging as seen by our teachers? And I don't have a table prepared for these results, but the main finding is, and I have to be really cautious with this result because we only included 8 student protocols because it's a very, very detailed analysis. For these 8 selected students, we found that those students selected scenes that correspond to the teacher selected scenes, but the teachers found more scenes. So let me give a summary of what we found out of these 3 studies. So we can say up to now, the self-judging processes related to history-taking skills can be theoretically modeled using the cue utilization model of metacognitive monitoring. That's the name for the general model of self-judgment I introduced in the beginning. We were able to show, based on this model, that high-performing students focus more on the interaction between them and the patient. So it's kind of natural that they use more patient-emitted cues and more subjective feeling cues when they monitor their performance. What we also found is that students' monitoring processes, at least as captured with this procedure here, seem to be rather accurate, but there is still some room for improvement. What we also learned about our newly introduced procedure of capturing the students' self-judgments is that we should modify our procedure and do not longer use the only 2 categories, judging satisfied, not satisfied, but use maybe a 7 categories rating scale instead. We experienced that doing the content analysis is kind of time-consuming, and training new coders for more larger-scale studies is still very time-consuming. So we need to consider that we have to work on our standardized training material and to establish rater consistency to be able to do a larger-scale study. And what's still open is the question of performance-dependent accuracy of self-judgments. That's important to follow because we know that in other domains, especially the weak-performing students are very prone for inaccurate judgments, and the higher-performing students are less prone for inaccurate judgments. So I think we are kind of lucky to have a lot of questions we still want to follow. So we still need to know how can weak performers be helped to pay attention to at the patient and thus use patient-emitted cues for self-judging. And we still need to know if using the patient-emitted cues really help the weak performers to learn better and thus improve their performance. And a very interesting question that arose when I discussed my previous results with our teachers and our external judges. The external judges came up with the idea that they actually should be trained in using cues similar to students because this would improve their judging during the practical exams. So we need to find out whether the external judges use the cues similar to students or whether there are some other cues our external judges use. Yeah, we're looking forward turning towards these next questions, and in the meantime, I say thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. And there is some time for questions. Who would like to start? Maybe some people who are at a distance, because we have quite some attendance. Some people attending at a distance. Okay, then I have one question. Because in your third study, there was a little more underestimation of the students' performance as compared to the teacher. How could you explain this?
This little more what we did here was a very detailed and a very strongly linked self-judgment. So what I want to say, the self-judgment the students did here was strongly linked to the situation they just experienced by seeing their video again. And what we also found in other domains is that a very strong link to a specific situations helps students to be more accurate. And in our case, this turned out to be very, very critically. So what in other studies helped students becoming more accurate, in our study it turned out to make them more critically. Does this make sense?
Yes, this does make sense. And perhaps is that then also a kind of tool that we could use to help them to improve their performance even better by watching a video and watching your own performance, or?
I can't really say now whether this effect is because of watching the video or because of doing it very strongly linked to a specific situation, because I haven't manipulated that. There are studies in other domains, I think in the knowledge domain from Kevin Eva's group, who also found a similar result, that when students have to judge after doing each item of a test, whether they feel confident or not, that they tend to be less confident that when judging a long distance after the test or when judging prior to the test. So it's the effect of self-judging after the performance and self-judging a very, very detailed aspect of performance. So I suppose you would find more overestimation if I told the students, oh, you just did your video, so how was your overall performance in this situation? Because then the situation is 15 minutes or 10 minutes and you are not so focused on a specific scene.